I never could have imagined when I sat down with my surly 80-year-old aunts in a grass hut on our family farm on Mount Kilimanjaro that our conversation that day would forever change the course of my life. Even though I grew up spending my childhood summers on that farm in Tanzania, I was a kid, more preoccupied with playing or reading or listening to Bowie on my Walkman. I was really into being American and less invested in learning about my cultural heritage. But when I hit my 30s, I started thinking about having kids of my own. And I realized that there was a lot I needed to learn about my Tanzanian family so that I could have something tangible to pass down. And so I set out to make a film about my family and culture. But it ended up being about the lens that we bring to the stories of our lives, the stories that we inherit about who we are and where we come from, and how we filter the stories that we pass down to the next generation. And you can really see how speaking our truth has the power to transform and heal, not just the speaker, but the listener as well. And that, to me, is the beauty of stories, and it's why our stories are so important. Now, just to be clear, by stories, I'm not talking about our highly sanitized, curated Facebook feeds. What I'm talking about is the vulnerable, deeply considered truth-seeking that explores those deeper questions of who am I, why am I here, and where do I belong? As a kid, I was obsessed with stories, and in particular, my origin story. Because even at 5, I knew how unlikely my existence was, and how wildly the universe had to conspire just so my parents could meet and fulfill their destiny of having me. My father was born and raised on that coffee farm on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. He was the youngest of 6 and a member of the Chaga tribe. And growing up, he would tell me stories about walking for miles to fetch water and sleeping in a grass-thatched hut with his family, together with their cows and goats. He ended up doing so well on his final exams that he got a scholarship to study in the US. And so at the age of 18, he took off. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, my mother was also the youngest of 6, growing up in Seoul, South Korea, which at the time was actually even poorer than Tanzania. She also aced her exams and received a Fulbright scholarship to study in the States, where she met my dad, and they fell in love, and 3 months later, they were married. So lying in bed, I would think about all the random life choices that had to happen, extending back generations, right? That had to happen just so my parents could meet and have me. And then as I got older, I realized that everyone has stories that are epic in scope, even if their families had lived in the same town for generations. Every one of us is the embodiment of the life stories of our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors. We carry these stories forward with us, whether we're conscious of them or not. But make no mistake, we are all here because of our stories. So as a kid, I was raised in the suburbs of DC, and both my parents worked for branches of the United Nations. So a lot of our family friends were international couples with mixed-race kids, many of whom were first-generation American like me. And so just about anyone who knew me knew my parents, so I didn't have to explain or justify who I was or how I identified. But that all changed when I went to university. And I remember one night sitting in an intro to sociology class, and I was the only visible student of color in a class of about 400, and my professor, who was white and male, was expounding on the violent mixing of blood between slave owners and their slaves, and the resulting politics of skin color privilege that continues to plague the African American communities to this day. And the whole time he's talking, he's looking directly at me. I was like, oh my God, this guy, he thinks he's telling my story. And with this crazy, intense eye contact, he was letting me know, I got this. I wanted to bolt out of that classroom so bad, but I stayed put. And he continued to glare right through me, and I felt completely exposed and completely unseen. And I felt the devastating power of having someone just take one look at you and construct their own narrative about who you are. And then, feel completely entitled to turn around and share that narrative with the world. I was livid, but I woke up that night. I woke to the reality of what it means to be a Black woman living in this country at this moment in time. And I realized that the history of Black people in the United States is necessarily my history, simply because people will assume it to be my history. And so I went back in, I dove back in, and I reread the stories of the civil rights movement, queer liberation, women's lib, anti-violence movement. And I saw how, at critical moments in our history, like this one we're in right now, our collective stories can contribute to the groundswell that leads to change. Okay, so now fast forward 12 years, and my career in crisis counseling is winding down. And one day, I hear a song driving to work that evokes memories of my summers in Tanzania. And in particular, my favorite drive from our farmhouse up in the mountain down to the nearest town in the plains, where on any given day, I could look out my car window and see elephants, gazelle, zebra, ostriches, just grazing by the side of the road. This wasn't national park land. This was just our drive into town. And this vision is playing out so vividly in my mind that it suddenly hits me that video would be the most effective way for me to go back to Tanzania, collect my family stories so that I can share them with my future kid. Never mind that I had zero experience in filmmaking or storytelling. That night I went home and I signed up for an intro to filmmaking class. And 7 months later, my partner and I quit our jobs and bought our equipment on eBay and one-way tickets to Tanzania. Now, when we landed, I found that Chaga culture, as I thought of it, was on the verge of disappearing. And so we made it our mission to try to capture and preserve what we could of this fading culture, right? But it was frustrating because I didn't feel like we were filming anything that felt authentic to me. And then I realized why. Now playing the role of that sociology professor was me. Here I was, I brought my Western gaze to Tanzania. I was pointing my camera at anything that even remotely resembled capital C culture, right, to me. Traditional songs, dance, folklore, spirituality, healing practices, all of this completely bound up in my own projections. When I realized what I was doing, I was so disappointed. Because seriously, having been on the receiving end of someone else's imposed narrative, how could I turn right around and do the same thing to someone else? I should know better. So I abandoned our culture search and turned my focus back on my family. And I discovered that being a cultural outsider actually worked to my advantage when it came to interviewing my family. I mean, I was insider enough to have access to Dad and his siblings, but I was still an outsider coming from the States. Plus, I had my camera, right? Which actually I was grateful for because it provided a comfortable buffer, allowing me to be curious with my family and ask them questions that, frankly, anyone raised on Kilimanjaro would have known were off limits. So I sat down with everyone in my family, and when we got around to my aunts, I won't lie, it was tense sitting in that hut with them because we were not close. We did not have a warm relationship. My aunts had always been cold and distant and angry, and as a kid, I didn't know what to do with that anger, and so I just left them alone. But on this day, I decided to be curious, and so I asked them about their childhood. I don't know what I was expecting. I mean, I thought I was asking them the questions that any of us would ask our elder relatives, right, if given the chance. Tell me about your life. What do you want me to know about how you've lived or what you've learned? Maybe I was also hoping to plug into stories involving ceremony and ritual, something that would feel uniquely and distinctly Chaga. But instead, I got the truth. With my camera rolling, my aunts opened up and shared stories with me about their experiences with female genital mutilation, a practice that I was aware of, but I had no idea was part of my family's legacy. And when I asked them how they got married, they told me about how they were kidnapped and raped by their future husbands, and about the ongoing abuse that they'd experienced in their homes. A lot of these stories, they never even shared with each other. I was totally caught off guard. Despite spending the past 12 years in the United States supporting survivors of rape and domestic violence, I never heard stories quite like this, right? Plus, this was family. It was painful, and it was raw. And honestly, my Swahili wasn't good enough to counsel them. So all I could do was bear silent witness. All I did was listen. But here's what happened. My aunts changed. Telling their stories to someone who cared enough to ask them about their life, it changed them. It changed the way they looked. It changed the way they held themselves. On screen, you can see my aunts transform as they release the pain and shame they've been carrying their entire lives. Their stories were no longer their burden to bear. They could finally let those go, knowing that I would be the carrier of their stories now. So when I say your stories are important, this is why. Because having the space to speak their truth mattered more to my aunts than being in my film, right? Speaking their truth, telling their stories, it set them free. And it set me free, too. After our conversation in the hut, my aunts left me with a challenge. They said, now that we've shared our stories with you, what are you going to do about it? For years, I thought this film was about my dad, moving back to Tanzania and struggling to fit back in with the family and culture he left behind. But 8 years into making this film, I finally realized if I was going to live up to my aunt's challenge, I had to follow their lead, and I had to speak my own truth. I needed to share my story and maybe make a film about my own journey to discover the cultural roots of my Blackness. Plus, my aunts had shown me that when we open ourselves up to seeing the world through someone else's eyes, especially someone whose world is so different from our own, right? Then that distance between us dissolves, and we experience their joys and their suffering as our own. And so, by centering myself in my own story, I could tell a story that allows for multiple conflicting truths, right? A story about the love and compassion that emerges when we allow all of it, the beauty and the brutality, the messiness, the grief, to exist side by side. But the toughest part of this entire journey was believing that I had the right to take up space with my story. Believing that what I thought as a queer, mixed-race, first-generation American, daughter of immigrants and survivor of rape and abuse, that my story would matter to anyone but me. And it's precisely because I had never seen a story that featured someone like me, or that was told by someone like me, or that was made by someone like me. But luckily, none of that mattered, because I was going into hard labor with this film. This story was coming, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And we're living at a time when most of us have access to the tools we need to tell and share our own stories, right? So we don't need to wait for permission, so just tell your story. For the past 5 years, I've been traveling around the world with this film. And after every screening, people from all walks of life come up, wanting to connect. Sometimes they're in tears, as they try to tell me how powerful it was to see their truth reflected back at them from the screen for the first time. They tell me that this is the first time they'd seen themselves, their families, their lives, their secrets, their struggles, represented so truthfully. And as a filmmaker, I can't think of a bigger compliment. But that is too many people who are living their lives, never seeing themselves represented in the media. And this invisibility is taking a toll on us all. So tell your stories and share them. Maybe you share your story at an open mic, and maybe you just reach one person. That's one person who will stand taller and breathe deeper after hearing your story. That's one person who will leave that night feeling validated and less alone, and maybe even inspired to find their own creative way to contribute their story. Because every time we share our story, we create a more expansive, inclusive portrait of humanity. And so this is what I wish. that we flood the world with enough of our stories that they rise or fall based on their own merit. And while I love connecting with people who are moved by my film, I don't want to be anyone's first anymore. I want my story to be 1 in a billion, as it should be. I want the world to be flooded with our stories. Thank you.